I'm your host, Soraya Sinozie, and this is Diaspora and Development, where we give voice to people of the diaspora working in international development. My guest today is Dr. Claudine Kuradusenge-McLeod. Claudine is a professional lecturer and the Director of Graduate Studies at American University in the School of International Service. She lectures on human rights and cultural relation. Claudine specializes in genocide studies and the intersection of diaspora consciousness and social mobilization. She is the 2023 Harry Frank Guggenheim Foundation Distinguished Scholar for Erasing Refugees, How Camps Became Killing Fields in the First Congo War, a joint project with Dr. Chris Davey. You'll find a complete bio on Claudine in the notes for this episode. Thank you for joining me, Claudine. So let's get into it. Claudine, can you tell us about your career trajectory and what led you to human rights and diaspora work?
Sure. I originally moved to the US to actually do public relations, focusing on crisis management. And one day I went to a talk that was talking about the Rwandan genocide. And as the only Rwandan in the room, I felt kind of a responsibility to correct one of the speakers who was saying a lot of things I didn't agree with. And that led to me wanting to be in the room as not only a Rwandan, but also as an expert. So I got into some human rights work. I decided to do an MA and then a PhD in conflict resolution. And since then, I've been kind of focusing on the intersection of human rights and genocide. And I am part of a diaspora community. I've been part of the diaspora community for the last 30 years or so. Mm-hmm. So a lot of my work has been kind of shaped by my community, how I engage in spaces, but also the complexity of memory, human rights, and the notion of homeland for diasporas.
Prior to moving to the States and prior to participating in this conversation, was there something calling you towards it? Because not only did you decide to do an MA and a PhD, was it something that was stirring in your brain in the past? Or was it that aha moment and you said, I can't?
So I've always been involved within like my community, right? But I never really wanted to be one of the voices, just because like many Rwandan, I have lost a lot and I have lost, I think, too much. And I did not necessarily want to be a loud voice. I was always there in terms of like, I'm there to help, I can volunteer, I can support, but I really did not want to be the person in the room until really kind of that event. Because I realized that when I'm not in my community, we don't have that many Rwandans. We don't have that many, mostly in the US, many Africans who are in spaces where they can represent their continent, their community, or their country. So I really felt that time that I just could not be on the sideline anymore. Like I need to make sure that one of us was in the room. And one of the ways to do that is to be the one in the room.
Exactly. Thank you. As a lecturer on human rights who has focused her work on genocide and most recently about the war in Congo, given the situation the world faces today, wars, genocide, and increased hostility to migrants, what do you want your students to learn and what do you want to leave with them?
I've had the privilege to really kind of create classes, design new classes, and engage in the different complexity, both of my personal life, but also professional lives in a lot of different ways. So I do teach classes on genocide studies. I do teach classes on diaspora and transnationalism. So I kind of have the opportunity to teach all those different complexity in like a 15 weeks in-depth conversation. But some of the most important thing for me to take on is that genocide itself is a legal term, but it has a lot of personal, political, and cultural significance for a lot of people. So if we focus too much on the terminology, we often lose the humanity of people, right? And we see that happening right now where we talk about this is the label, but we forget the faces behind it. Or we talk about the faces, but we don't want to use the label.
To interject, the label is an interesting thing. People don't want to say the word. They're careful of saying the word, and I guess it's because it's a legal word. What do we see that leads to this word?
Yeah, like we've seen examples of like people talking about acts of genocide, but going short of calling an event an actual genocide, right? And sadly, labels are necessary because labels are kind of wake up call for all of us to realize that things are not okay. And also, labels have some positive and negative aspects for sure. But in a lot of ways, especially the label of genocide, when you look at it through the lens of like the kind of full crimes, like ethnic cleansing, crime against humanity, war crime, and genocide, the label of genocide and the legal aspect that comes with genocide has this understanding of we have the responsibility as an international community to actually act, right? So when you call something a genocide, it is through the UN conventions, it is we have to actually act. And that is where I think the complexity and the unwillingness comes from. Because if we're calling something a genocide, then someone has to do something to either stop it or hopefully prevent it. And that someone is then where the problem is. Who's going to do it? And looking at the Security Council in the UN, we see that politics is more important than humanity. But it's a sad reality that often happens. So I had the pleasure to teach classes on genocide. Oh, I don't know if that's a pleasure, but in my head, being able to have conversations with kids who are getting ready to like start a career and talk to them about genocide through the lens of like, yes, we have this genocide that we all have recognized. This is all the pattern. These are the evidence we have. But then we have hundreds of other crimes, hundreds of other instances that happened that really fit the same criteria, that really talks about the same pattern, but those are not called genocide. What is the politics around it? What is what we call the social death that comes with that? And most importantly, how do we talk about peace? How do we talk about human rights? How do we talk about reconciliation if those are being recognized, these are not being recognized, but they feel like they have the same legitimacy? And I think the most complex and interesting space there is that we do have centuries of like genocidal evidence that are seen through slavery, through colonialism, through this kind of neo-imperialist system, that those are not even like talked about at
No,
addressed.
we don't put two and two together. We're very afraid to put two and two together. And it's interesting that you talk about, is it a pleasure to teach? My first MA was in peace and development. I can say that it's not a pleasure to learn what goes on when we're talking about violence against people, cultural violence, physical violence, etc. But it is a pleasure to understand how we can work towards ending it.
Yeah, like the pleasure for me is like having those tough conversations with students and then having that aha moment where a student is like, oh, what about this? And I'm like, oh, yes, let's deconstruct, bring that on. Like, let's actually do this together. So I think that's where the pleasure really comes from. It is not from the actual material, but it's from taking the material and able to like expand it and see it through different lenses. And like in my class, we really talk about first, we talk about slavery and colonialism as the foundational spaces to engage with genocide study. We talk about indigenous communities and how they've been really decimated. We talk about places like Namibia as really being kind of the test for the Holocaust, right? And things like that. And then when it comes to human rights, as someone who comes from the global south, as someone who is seeing a lot of like human rights abuse in my own country and different spaces I'm part of, I think the conversation, especially in my class around human rights, is starting with the human rights versus cultural relativist, right? Why people do not believe in human rights the way they are being established, the way they've been implemented. Why do we have so many different like decreed and like actual like reframing of human rights through like women's rights, through indigenous and through all those different communities that are supposed to be included within human rights. And these conversations really kind of highlight their all lives matter versus Black lives matters versus women's life matters. Like how do we have all those different things coming to the same space but clashing under our international understanding of what that is? And that's why I love my job and that's why I love what I do.
You sound like you love your job. The passion is there. There's an interesting thing that you said when we talked about starting with slavery, and there's something going very interesting that I see going on today when we talk about the different wars. Also, when we talk about who is deserving of human rights, there is a step to start to dehumanize people. And then within that dehumanization, then you open up the floodgates to be. Can you talk a little bit about that?
A step to dehumanizing. What do you mean by that?
I mean, when you think that slaves are not humans, or when you think that indigenous people are less than humans, and when you think Palestinians are less deserving of, etc., you start to seep into the community, into a global thinking of who's more human than others.
Okay, so this is where my constructivist mind comes from. I'm a huge constructivist, right? And I'm also like someone who loves studying and talking about identity formation and identity transformation. That's really kind of what my work has been through all the different fields and lenses, but that's really how I, in some ways, have conceptualized a lot of my work with different fields, right? And I always tell my students that we are the heroes of our own stories. Of course, we're never going to be the bad guys. And even if we are the bad guys, the stories we're going to tell about ourselves and to ourselves are going to be us as victims and the other ones as alternate perpetrators. Mm-hmm. So in a lot of ways, if you're looking at like slavery, if you're looking at colonialism, if you're looking at just the dehumanization of people that leads to violence and like mass atrocities, really comes from this understanding of us versus them, mm-hmm. and how us, our people, the people who look like us, we gain self-esteem through identify who those people are. And then our self-esteem grows and grows by identifying who are not part of our group, right? So the people who are not part of our group, for us to feel better about ourselves, we have to dehumanize them. Because if we don't dehumanize them, then what makes us special? What makes my story better? What makes me the hero of my own story? And the hero of my own story really comes with identify who the protagonist or who the evil person is. So you add power dynamic there, then you have the power to enact any behavior or any thoughts against those that you already have identified as the bad person, right? And the third crazy thing that comes with that is what we call like narratives of identity, mm-hmm. is those stories that we talk about ourselves, mm-hmm. and how those stories are a representation of who we are. Mm-hmm. But those stories allow us to justify why we do, and allow us to justify why we think the other people are not good people, right? Mm-hmm. So if you put all those things together, then it becomes almost natural to point finger, mm-hmm. and then from pointing finger, you're going to start acting on it. From acting on it, then you're going to start dehumanizing the other person, finding out the bad things you think the other people are in some ways representing, and how you then are the only person who can stop them. You're the only person who has the truth, or the only person who is right. All that is left is dehumanizing them because they are bad. They are, of course, bad because you are in the right. Does that make sense?
It makes sense. It makes sense. Unfortunately, it makes sense. Thank you. That was a masterclass in that. Thank you. For many in developing countries, Rwanda is an example. A country that after genocide, together with the diaspora, returned, and the country turned itself around without the aid of foreign assistance. Do you think Rwanda is an example for others to follow? Why or why not?
So first, Rwanda will not be where it is without foreign assistance. I think that's kind of something we need to make sure that we clarify, right? Like Rwanda will not be where it is without having humanitarian assistance, without having those both military but also intellectual kind of aids we received in the country. And intellectual really comes from rebuilding the country, from trauma healing programs and things like that, right? But in terms of like Rwanda being an example to others, I would say let's look at Rwanda's record currently. Rwanda is going into, I think it's been 30 years now. This year is the 30th anniversary of the Rwandan genocide. In 30 years, we've had one president, really. President Paul Kagame has been in power for like 24 years now. He's running for his fourth term, and he's the only actual real candidate. Rwanda's democratic and human rights records right now is not good. Like if you look at different reports, including Freedom House, Rwanda, we're like 22 out of 100 in terms of like actual democratic institution, human rights. Even the US government actually issued a press release about Rwanda being a kidnapping state since they kidnapped one of the Rwandan diaspora, Paul, who was the hero of Hotel Rwanda, the movie. Rwanda has an incredible, extensive transnational repression. So I don't think Rwanda is an example to follow. President Kagame and the RPF inherited a country that was destroyed and a people that was traumatized and hurt by months of unbelievable atrocity. So with that specific scenario, Rwanda has made a lot of progress, and Rwanda has kind of rise from the ashes. But after that, the record is not positive. And the picture I'm painting comes from really me focusing on genocide and kind of international and human rights spaces. In terms of development, Rwanda has, in a lot of ways, made a lot positive strikes compared to other countries around. Rwanda has paved roads. Kigali is one of the cleanest space in all Africa. Like the investment in tech, investment in like kind of education have been very admirable for a country 30 years ago that was kind of destroyed. So the infrastructure and kind of that humanitarian space and development has been very positive. Unfortunately, then the other records are not necessarily there.
There are people who left prior to the genocide. There are people who never grew up in Rwanda, and there are people who did return to Rwanda. But it seems there has been a confluation of people, the diaspora returning. As you know, as an immigrant, and I am a child of immigrants, the story is always, we're going to go back home. And that rarely sometimes doesn't happen. So that part, can you talk a little bit about it?
Sure. Yes, diaspora rarely return home. They have the idea of like returning eventually, but life happens. Most of them do not. The return in Rwanda has been extremely interesting in a lot of different ways. Within the first 3 to 4 years of the genocide, a massive group of refugees has returned to Rwanda. And that is also because the refugee camps were closing, like the refugee camp in the neighboring countries. A lot of them were closing because of the idea of the understanding that Rwanda was stable and safe. So we had then that first kind of big wave of like people returning. The other wave of returning was in some ways also in the immediate after the genocide, where you had a lot of Rwandans, mostly actually Tutsis, who had grew up in refugee camps, had grew up outside Rwanda with the desire to come back home. So after the genocide, you did have a lot of them who also came back and wanted to come back to Rwanda and lived home. It is important to also mention that President Kagame and the RPF, a lot of them had been refugees, and it is in their desire peacefully and non-peacefully to return that a lot of the instability kind of that led to some of the atrocity and then to the genocide really happened. After 2005, Rwanda really made a push to the diaspora, asking them to come back. Rwanda had changed. Rwanda needed investment. The country was stable. So they really made a push, a campaign to like invite Rwandans to come back. Really, the idea was like, come back and see for yourself. And that is still present now. Like really come back instead of like listening to all those people outside talking about Rwanda. Come back, look at the country, look at what we have done, what we want to do, and then make a decision for yourself, right? It was that kind of, hey, come and see. And a lot of people have done it. A lot of people have done it for a lot, especially those who were born right after or before, those people who had kind of grew after Rwanda. That was kind of the first tastes of the country they could see. And then, of course, Rwanda has been putting a big show for like Rwandans and international to come and see and invest in Rwanda. The other side of that is that also Rwanda has lost a lot of people kind of moving out of the country because of some of the track record, because of the lack of like actual rights for a lot of people. And Rwanda in some ways control a lot of the social and political life of Rwandans within the country. And another interesting part is it has been extremely hard for Rwanda to actually get documentation to be able to leave the country too, right? So actual Rwandans who live in Rwanda, getting documentation to really either migrate to a different place or like just move to go see different places, that also has been harder, especially in the last 10 years or so, which has in some ways prevented a lot of people from leaving. And then Rwanda, as I say, is not a free country, so not everybody can share how they feel about life.
Okay, thank you. Too often when we speak about war, we talk about winners and losers, collateral damage, and rarely the loss of life, the wipeout of generations of families, cultural landmarks, hopes, and dreams. In the aftermath, we also talk about who was on the right side and the wrong side of history. You write about the Bosnian diaspora and the Hutu diaspora. Most would see the Bosnian Serbs as the perpetrators in the Bosnian and Kosovo War, and the Hutus the perpetrators in the Rwandan genocide. However, this is often much more complex. Can you tell us about your work in this area? What do we need to know about victims of war, the responsibility of the diaspora, and perhaps what lessons can be learned or applied to our current context?
Thank you. So my initial work was really looking at identity and identity transformation within the post-Rwanda. And I was really interested in those stories, right? And of course, the stories we were hearing were kind of stories of victimhood, coming from like genocide against Tutsis. And I was interested in those stories that are not being told, those stories that are in some ways a reflection of really 85% of the whole country, like 85% of the population in Rwanda is Hutu. So I was really interested in like what are the other stories that are present that we're not hearing? And that's why I initially focused on Hutus. But then in my dissertation, I really kind of wanted to look at the holistic story of Rwanda. So I looked at Rwanda, Hutus, Tutsi, and Kwa, and then the same in Bosnia. And I was interested in the differences between those two countries. The atrocity happened around the same time. Both of them experienced civil wars, genocide, and both of them experienced a heavy international presence in the aftermath.
Yes,
So I was
I was
really
in
interested.
Kosovo in 2007. So.
Yes, so I was really interested in what was happening and how those two cases led to really kind of a shift in our international laws, especially when it comes to like genocide, and the creation of the ICC, the International Criminal Court, right? So those were kind of the spaces I was interested in. But going back to labels, I do love to understand how labels shaped the way people navigate these spaces, right? How they understand themselves. And I was interested in how the label of perpetrator or the label of victim shaped that transgenerational understanding of being from a specific country. So I really looked at both how they identify ethnically, but how the label attached to a specific ethnicity then shape the stories that are being told, shape the responses, and then shape the younger generation connection to the country they come from. In this case, the Hutu and the Bosnian Serb were the one identified as the perpetrators. The Tutsi and the Bosniak were those identified as victim. But then you had the Bosnian Croat and you had the Tukwa, who were completely, in some ways, absent from the conversation when it comes to the atrocity that had happened and how that shaped the country and the violence, right? So those labels in some ways were allowing me to look at the complexity of that victimhood understanding of war and how even if you were labeled as a perpetrator, again, you are the victim of your own story, right? But where's that story starting from? Are you starting from the atrocity that happened in the time frame we have identified? Or are you looking at an event or something in the past that in some ways allow it to justify why your community took specific action in a specific time frame in a specific context, right? So even within those labels, the overarching conversation was all those people see themselves as the victim of the war in a lot of different capacity. And what does that mean if you see yourself as a victim of something, but nobody recognizes you as the victim? What does that mean if you are a victim or if you're recognized as the victim and you see yourself as a victim? What are the differences in those stories? And how are those stories shaping the next generation? And that next generation is where that kind of nexus of diaspora comes to play.
Mm-hmm.
And that book, the first one, really kind of talked about the connection between those labels, the narrative created within those labels, and then political participation. So how
Mm-hmm.
they engage in their own community, but also how they engage with the country they come from.
Mm-hmm.
And this is where the diaspora comes to play, right?
Mm-hmm.
Where you did have people who were identified as perpetrator but identify themselves as victim. And a good number of them engage in what I call radical thinking, in
Mm-hmm.
the sense of like, either radical in the sense of like they just did not want to engage with the community or the country they come from, or the engagement were more activist and they were more, some of them were a little bit more extreme in how they were engaging. Extreme in the sense of like maybe denying the genocide
Mm-hmm.
or denying that the atrocity really happened the way they happened or the way they claimed that it happened, or engaging in.
Is the denial always does the denial always come from a point of seeing yourself as a victim in a perpetrator, but being part of what is thought as a perpetrator community, or does the denial also include the incapacity to deal with the atrocity?
I think both are connected, right? Both are connected in the sense of you have people who deny that something happened
Mm-hmm.
because they didn't do it, right? They're like, I did not do it. You're saying that my people did, but I didn't. So what you're saying is not true,
Mm-hmm.
right? Or there's that denial of not all of us did it. So
Mm-hmm.
because not all of us did it, the version of the fact you say, oh, I know some of you did it too. So if some of you did it, then this should not be labeled this specific way. This should be labeled another way, right?
Mm-hmm.
Or the other aspect that comes with denying is in some ways tied to mostly questioning again. Like
Mm-hmm.
you are really questioning the reality of the facts that you've been told, or you are trying to complexify.
Mm-hmm.
And by complexifying it, you're in some ways denying that what you're being told is really what happened. So, for
Okay.
example, you had people like, no, it wasn't a genocide. It was maybe a crime against humanity,
Mm-hmm.
but it was not a genocide.
Mm-hmm.
And you're like, but these are the facts. And they're like, yes, I understand what you're saying, but this happened to us too. So
Mm-hmm.
if it happens to us, you have to talk about double, or you have to like bring your label down to actually come back to where I think we should be and things like that.
Interesting. Interesting.
You ask about the responsibility of the diaspora.
Yeah.
That's an interesting question because the diaspora is stuck in time,
Mm-hmm.
right? In the sense of the way they remember home is really the home they left or the
Uh-huh.
home they were part of
Mm-hmm.
fully. So the diaspora really stuck in time. And when a country is, I think I'll call smart enough, or when the leaders of countries are smart enough to engage with the diaspora in a way that they can make them productive part of the broader community, then in some ways that is helpful, and that shows that the diaspora has more stability than just investing the country financially, like through the money they send to family, right? But that does not happen often. Often diaspora tend to be divided because of political agenda in terms of like who's in power, because of ethnic or even racial like differences that comes from when they left and things like that. Or just because they just don't like where the country is, and they're like, okay, I have the power, I can lobby, I can do whatever I need to do to make sure that my side of the story is going to be the one told instead of like that side I'm hearing that I don't like, right? But at the end of the day, the diaspora across the different communities has had a big responsibility in terms of they've been the biggest advocates in the international sphere when it comes to their countries, right? And we see that now with Israel and Palestine, right? How the Palestinian diaspora is literally a force to reckon with when it comes to everything. We saw them yesterday. They were protesting at the outside the Oscars. They've been protesting Biden in a lot of different spaces, both politically in terms of like voting, but also physically in stuff like marching and like being there, like in people's faces, right? So in a lot of ways, the diaspora have been that force to like force changes and help their country, but also in a lot of ways, the diaspora has been that interesting conflict making space where diaspora, if they don't like things, as I said, they sponsor like the sponsor militia group. We see that in the DRC. They try to take down government. We see that in a lot of different spaces. So diaspora have had a big responsibility in the creation of peace and the creation of conflict, in keeping their country accountable for like human rights violation, things like that. But when it comes to lesson we need to take from all these interesting complexity we're talking about, I think it is not all diaspora have a very similar journey and attachment to their home country, right? For them to call themselves diaspora, it is in some ways a statement, like a security blanket they take on, right? So with that security blanket, it comes with responsibilities, and they engage in those responsibilities. Then the complexity there is that the diaspora is now united.
Yeah.
The tension and fight they experience back home are coming to the space and the host country they live in. So there's no real unification of the diaspora, and I'm not even sure that that will ever happen. There's no collective understanding of what peace and what a peaceful, sustainable country back home will or should look like. And because of that, then the diaspora engage with their homeland differently. And really, the main lesson here is for those countries to really understand the power behind the diaspora and to really purposively and consciously engage with the diaspora in a way that will be meaningful to the country and not necessarily help increase attention and help in other ways create the next big war in their own home countries.
Thanks. International treaties, agreements, organizational and judicial bodies are a best way to hold nations and their leaders accountable. It's often that their impacts are seen as mostly symbolic. Is there still a place for these instruments to play a role in protecting human rights around the world? Why or why not?
That's an interesting and kind of a tough question. I do believe they all still have a space, even if the space is symbolic. The space still exists. Like I know so many people who don't believe in the UN, and a lot of people have lost faith in the UN, and I understand why. And as of London, I can assure you that I know why they don't believe in it, right? But I also know that we would not necessarily have those collective understanding of how we should understand community or what is the value of dignity and what does that mean without having those initial kind of conversations, right? So even the symbolic actions are actions that are important. Even the performative things that happen are necessary, right? The problem is not the performative or the symbolic. The problem is then the lack of accountability measure built within them, right? Like if we had an accountability clause that would be like, if you do this, these are the consequences, and those consequences are coming with this penalty, then I don't think we'll have all those veto happening from the U.S. when it comes to the UN right now.
What type of consequences could you see?
Humanitarian assistance. Like I think that unfortunately sanctions often help government but do not help people, right? So I don't believe in sanction per se, right? Like if you want to impose sanction right now on Haiti, because the situation in Haiti is getting worse and worse.
As a Haitian, I know full well.
Yes,
Yes, yes,
yes,
yeah.
right.
And sanctions have not helped us in the past.
No, absolutely not. So sanctions tend to like really help the leaders because nothing's going to really happen to them. Everything's going to kind of trickle down to the people.
Mm-hmm.
So instead of sanctioning people, I'm like, follow the money, where the money is going into like a Cayman Islands bank account somewhere that belongs to a president. That is where, in some ways, you want to think about what needs to happen, not necessarily going after the people. But again, this is where we've gone so long with our accountability that we can't even conceptualize what that will look like, right?
Mm-hmm.
Especially in a globalized world like us, where we're all interdependent,
Mm-hmm.
where if I'm doing something to you,
Mm-hmm.
other countries are relying on you.
Mm-hmm.
So if we're sanctioning someone or some country, all the other ones are going to kind of suffer.
Mm-hmm.
So
Yeah.
we have to rethink the system. Like I always tell my students, we have to stop thinking about burning the place down,
Yeah.
but really think about what that flame will be. Like, don't burn the place down, but what will be that flame that in some ways threaten those who feel like they are about to lose,
Mm-hmm.
right? But that comes with us rethinking what humanity and the value of humanity is in the context we are currently. And I don't think we have the imagination to do it, but I'm really hoping that the next generation will get there.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Are there any programs, individuals, and organizations led by people of color that you'd like to highlight that do this type of work and do it well?
Ah, that's a tough one. I am in a space that is mostly white.
Mm-hmm.
Really, the space I'm in is mostly white. So finding an organization that does some of these that I will mention, can I get back to you on that? I have a couple of things. I think they are mostly in Europe,
Yeah.
because that's where a lot of my kind of
Mm-hmm.
activism work is, not
Mm-hmm.
necessarily here in the US.
Mm-hmm.
Which is where the problem is,
Yeah.
right? If
Mm-hmm.
like as a person of color cannot think of something straight coming to my mind,
Yeah.
I think we have a bigger problem here.
You can certainly get back to Diaspora and Development. We'll put it up. We'll post it. Um, is there anyone that you can think of that if people have heroes or people they'd like to emulate? Yeah.
There was one person that came to mind for
Mm-hmm.
me. Her name was Law.
Mm-hmm.
She was in France. She got murdered like 3 years ago
Mm-hmm.
because of her activism. She was originally from DRC.
Okay.
Makana,
Makana.
Law Makana.
Okay. Mm-hmm.
I need to think about someone alive.
Oh no, you don't. And why was she important to you?
I think because I wanted to be her when I grew up, right?
Mm-hmm.
Despite the fact she was younger than me,
Mm-hmm.
in the sense of she was not afraid to talk. She
Mm-hmm.
was always there and she always knew what was needed when it was needed.
Mm-hmm.
And in some ways, she was the best advocate for her own people when her people didn't necessarily like her.
Mm-hmm. Perfect. Thank you. So we're coming towards a close. We'd like to know what's next for you, and then we'll ask you a little bit about some fun things. What's next for you?
Okay, so I am currently working on a couple projects. One of them, I received the Henry Guggenheim grant to do research on erased
Congratulations.
stories. Thank you. On erased stories. So it's looking at refugees who went through the refugee camps in the DRC during the First Congolese War and looking at the stories of resiliency, but also what happened to them and how in some ways they understood what happened really, where they are now, and some of the complexity of like being Rwandan refugees in a country that's also slowly experiencing a war that might have been caused by Rwandan too. So it's an interesting space. So I have that one. And then the other one, I'm working on what I see as a cultural death in the sense of looking at the second and third generation of diaspora who were born and grew up in a different country and thus they speak the language of where they come from, then so have the cultural and traditional aspect of that. But like, what does that mean for then those countries when the next generations are not involved. They don't speak the language, they don't understand the culture, and they're fully assimilated. So how do you understand that? So that's kind of the other project I am working on.
Thanks. And we always end with a little bit of fun. Can you share with us the last TV show you've binged and loved, your favorite movie,
Sure.
your get up and dance song?
Okay, so let's start with the TV show I binged. It's called Monarch on Apple TV. Yeah, it's called Monarch on Apple TV. I'm a huge monster person, like Godzilla, aliens.
We
I don't know if
can
you can
see
see
this. We can
my
see this.
background. Yes.
The audience listening will not be able to see, but I was looking. I'm like, is that Godzilla? And then on the
Oh,
left,
yes.
I was like, that's another monster. And I was like, there's something there. So yes.
Yes. I do have like 5 Godzilla behind me, and I have 2 aliens behind me. And then I have, of course, Black Panther things, Star Wars. But yeah, like I'm a huge Godzilla, meaning my favorite movie is actually Godzilla. There's one coming out in 2 weeks.
Yes.
And then there's one that just won the Oscar
yesterday.
yesterday.
Yes.
Yesterday.
Yeah. And they came up with Godzilla toys. It was really nice. Lovely.
Yes. I think they're coming out officially. They'll be available for purchase this week. So I already have them on my Amazon cart. Like Amazon list, they should pay me to just buy all those different things, because I'm a huge fan. I have kids too, so we always have dinosaur everywhere in the house.
Super.
Yes. In terms of a song I am addicted to right now, it's called So from Omale. It's Nigerian. So that's kind of my, okay, let's do this.
Cool. Thank you very much, Claudine. It was a pleasure talking to you.
You're welcome. Thanks for having me.